Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank Anne for the invitation. It's really great to be back here in Duke, where I spent wonderful years, more than 25 years ago, and also her staff for organizing everything in such an impeccable way. So I'm going to be talking about the evolution of lemur social systems, and I don't have to spend too much time convincing you about the many aspects of lemur diversity that are really interesting, some of which we've already heard about today. And I have always been mostly interested in the diversity of the lemur social systems. And the big question in this context for me has always been the question about convergent evolution during this adaptive radiation over the last 50-odd million years. So in what respects do lemurs show social traits that we can also find in other anthropoids? And if not, and you've already got a glimpse of that from Christine, how can we explain it and what does it tell us? And so in this talk today, I briefly want to summarize some older work on the actual description and classification of social systems, and then take a different perspective and look at the big evolutionary picture based on some reconstructions in this context. And in the final part, I want to look more at the interaction between lemurs and their environment and try to explain some of the patterns that we find. And for reasons of time and ignorance, most of the work that I'm presenting today will be based on the work by my students and myself, which took place at Kirindy Forest, where Jörg Ganshorn initiated a project very soon after I graduated from Duke. So the first objective here is just to sort of describe some of the salient features of lemur social systems, and to start with a boring definition, I will distinguish among the social organization, so how individuals are distributed in space and time, the mating system, who mates or reproduces with whom, and the social structure, which summarizes other social interactions. And where do I have to point here? Okay. And so starting with the social organization of the solitary species, this is something that I turned to after leaving Duke. The frontier in those days were the social organization of the nocturnal lemurs, and something that emerged very quickly from these field studies was that there's tremendous diversity in social organization among these solitary species. So for example, in Mursa, cockerelli, female ranges tend to be clumped, whereas those of males are dispersed, whereas in the sympatric Madame Bert's mouse lemur, we find the opposite pattern. So females are dispersed and males are clumped, and in the third chirogalid in this forest, we find yet another pattern where female and male ranges overlap with those of many other individuals. So lots of variation in these solitary species. We also have a number of pair-living species, and sort of the most interesting result in retrospect based on work with these animals was that they were found to be living in a type of social organization that had not been reported before. Specifically, we have a situation where one male and one female share a range, and they also defend it against neighbors, but as can be seen in this more recent result on the white-footed lepi lemurs in Berenti, these pair partners who share a range over an entire year had exactly an average of 0 affiliative interactions. So that's why we call them dispersed pairs. They're just like two gas molecules occupying the same range, but they do not directly interact. The social organization of group living species is characterized by a number of interesting features. So for one thing, their groups tend to be much smaller than those of anthropoid primates. They also tend to have an average of the same number of adult males and females, which is in contrast to most anthropoids. And those species that live in groups that would be called multi-male, multi-female groups in anthropoids can be regularly found also in other constellations with one or multiple members of the same or the opposite sex. So they're tremendously variable in group composition, including pairs. So moving on to the mating systems, one thing that we have learned in the last couple of years is that the mating systems of the group living lemurs appear to be characterized by a high male reproductive skew. In the Viroche at Kirindy, for example, we found that in those groups, I didn't show any genitals, so okay, yet. Thanks. So in those groups shown here in red, where you have more than one male, one of them is responsible for more than 90% of the paternity, so extremely high male reproductive skew. And the red-fronted lemurs in the same forest, where we have multiple males, also a single male is responsible for over 70% of paternities. Christine already talked about sexual dimorphism, which is one main predicted correlate of mating systems. And here we find a general pattern comparing solitary, pair-living, and group-living species that deviates now from some expectations based on sexual selection theory, because essentially if we look at the frequency distribution with which different species exhibit sexual dimorphism, there is no effect of the social organization. If we turn to the testicles and look at the variation in their relative size and relate it to the number of males that females typically mate with, there we, in contrast, find a clear predicted picture that those species shown here in red, where females typically mate with only a single male, tend to have smaller testes for their body size. And finally, looking at the social structure of the group living species, we already heard about female dominance, something that has been noticed by Ellis and Jolly a long time ago. There's also, compared to many anthropoids, the interesting fact that males tend to be rather peaceful in their interactions, and these intense episodes of female aggression resulting in eviction in the field is something that we have also seen a lot in our red-fronted lemurs, and you can see that peaks of these evictions correlate also with the mating season and with the birthing season in the field. These females do not regularly form coalitions in these contexts, so they do not help each other. There is also little evidence for reconciliation in general. Also, if you look at the dynamics of the rank relationships among females, lemurs differ from most Old World anthropoid, at least, in that there is no maternal rank inheritance. So if we look at this first package of the variation in social organization, one point that I would like to emphasize here is that even after all these years, we still know nothing about the social organization of about 2/3 of the lemur species that have been described in the meantime. There is a lot of variation, especially in the nocturnal species, that remains to be studied. and then some others, like these dispersed pairs, exhibit patterns that are really unique, and also the group living species differ in several key features. The mating systems, here we saw that there is a mismatch between the mating system to the extent that we know it and the degree of sexual dimorphism, but the rest, especially the reproductive skew and testis size, etc., that's sort of as expected. And as we already heard, the social structure is really, of the group living species, is really characterized by female competition and dominance, and also a lack of social empathy. So these females tend to look after their own interests more so than other aspects. So given this diversity of solitary, pair living, and group living species, how did this diversity come about? And in this section, I want to look at two specific aspects. One is the evolution of pair living, and then the evolution of group living. And the evolution of pair living has been in the focus of behavioral ecologists in the last couple of years based on two very interesting papers. First one by Susanne Schulz and colleagues a few years ago in Nature, who pointed out that according to their data, about 19% of primates are pair living, and that if they do a phylogenetic reconstruction, they find 6 transitions to social monogamy, all from group living ancestors. But then a few years later, Dieter Lucas and Tim Clattenbrock did a similar analysis over all mammals, and their data suggested now that there are even a larger proportion of primates that's monogamous, and they found 7 transitions to social monogamy within the primates, and 6 of them from solitary ancestors. So clearly we have a problem here, and since almost half of the 15 lemur genera include pair living species, I thought it would be interesting to focus on the animals that are dearest to us and see what we can learn about the evolution of monogamy on Madagascar. And so together with my postdoc Luca Pozzi, we did a phylogenetic reconstruction of these 3 different types of social systems, and we could show here that pair living, shown in red, actually evolved multiple times among lemurs from both solitary and group living ancestors. And if we focus a little bit into and look at this variation, I want to share a scenario with you that could explain how this diversity came about. And so this scenario is based on the assumption that we do not get sudden changes in all traits from one type of social organization to another one, but rather that this change is stepwise and based on existing acceptations. And with that, we can use information about living species to sort of perform an ordination according to variation that we see today in some of the traits that are relevant. And so these other studies in Nature and Science suggested that female territoriality and male mating strategies and paternal care were sort of the key important factors in this context. And we can, using this logic, then identify actually 2 transitions to pair living among lemurs. One is from solitary ancestors to pair living species that now acknowledges variation both among the solitary species, but also among the pair living species that we have today. And so we can look at factors like how frequently do males and and females share a sleeping site? Is there any duetting? What is known about paternal care? Looking at the single population, how many of the social units are actually pairs? How many are characterized by polygyny or polygynous constellations where a male has two or more females? And you can see that we can order these living species in a way that leads to the type of pairs that we find among Avahi, for example, which are most similar to those that we find among the anthropoids. But then there's also been a second transition from permanent groups in the eulemurs and hapalemurs, where we also have independent evolution of pair living based from these group living ancestors. And here the idea is that female competition and perhaps also interspecific competition may have been the driving forces responsible for this transition. Now, looking at the same reconstructions again, and I just want to highlight this point without going into any further detail, now focusing on the yellow branches of this tree. According to most currently used phylogenies, it's obvious that group living has evolved twice independently among the lemurs, compared to only once among all other anthropoid primates. And once in the Lemuridae, once in the Indridae, and so actually comparisons between members of these two radiations can also inform evolutionary questions. So to summarize this part, compared to other primates and even other mammals, pair living is really exceptionally common among lemurs. It evolved multiple times from both solitary and group living ancestors, and thus presumably also for different reasons. And also group living evolved at least twice independently, because we don't really know how the extinct subfossil lemurs were organized. And so from this perspective, lemurs can really contribute important and interesting comparative information to those interested in the evolution of primate sociology. In the last couple of minutes, I want to focus on some evolutionary processes and mechanisms that may have given rise to this diversity that we see today. And we already heard about some of the unusual features of the group living lemurs that I've called the lemur syndrome a few years ago. So we have these relatively small groups with 1 to 5 females. The adult sex ratios tend to be even or even slightly male biased in these groups. And we have these episodes of targeted aggression and eviction among related females in the same groups. These species tend to have also female dominance, whereas male-male relationships are much more amicable and tolerant. We know everything about female genital masculinization now, which is a striking part of this package, as is the absence of sexual size dimorphism, at least in terms of body mass. And so this package of traits, I think, and I'm going further than Christine here, I think all of them are somehow related, has occupied the scientific fantasies of many of us for the last couple of years, and there are various explanations for this package of traits, focusing, for example, on particular aspects of the ecology of Madagascar, then also focusing for a long time on particular mechanisms of sexual selection, especially male-male competition, and then, as we just heard, there's also been a fascinating research program looking at the more proximate aspects, which, as Christine just argued, has been suggested to be ancestral for all of the lemurs. When Claudia Fichtel and myself reviewed all this literature about a year ago, we tried to put all this information together, and here's where I differ from Christine, because I think the why questions are also interesting and important in this context, not just the how questions, and so we tried to put everything together under this fancy title, and we came up with a new hypothesis or scenario that could explain the evolution of this lemur syndrome, and I just want to walk you through it. So we start with fairly good evidence that Madagascar is characterized by strong seasonality in most areas, and that there is also climatic unpredictability, which translates into unpredictability within sites in food availability. And this unpredictability is so predictable that it results in recurrent energetic and social stress, especially for females and especially during periods when they reproduce. And so this will lead to, increased selection on female competition, and in the extreme form, these evictions, or in other species, voluntary dispersals of females. Now, if females experience this type of stress during periods of reproduction, we know from studies of some lab rodents that there is a mechanism in mammals, but also been shown in some fish, that maternal stress during pregnancy can lead through some endocrinological mechanism to the masculinization of daughters and the feminization of sons. And our idea and proposal is now that if these conditions have prevailed and if all these assumptions are correct over millions and millions of generations, that these lemur females have been canalized through this chronic filial masculinization into a condition that improves their competitive ability, so that they tend to be larger in size relative to males, that they tend to live in smaller groups, that females may also experience more mortality resulting in even sex ratios, and that males may even also be more tolerant to each other. Now, this is just an idea based on many assumptions at the moment, but lemurs are not the only mammals in Madagascar, and if some of these assumptions can be tested with the other big radiations of mammals that we find there, so the rodents, the tenrecs, and the carnivores, the mongooses. And they all also descended from ancestral species still having living representatives in mainland Africa. And we can therefore compare these four radiations, and in a recent study based on data primarily from Steve Goodman and with methods contributed by Charlie Nunn, we found that in 3 out of 4 of these radiations, the degree of sexual size dimorphism is also reduced in the Malagasy lineage compared to the African one. The only exception seem to be the carnivores here, but we have a small sample size and some ideas why this may be the case. So to summarize that part, I think it's fair to say at this point that Madagascar's ecology seems to create conditions that select for exceptional female competitive abilities, and this has ramifications for all these other aspects of their social systems that I summarized for you today. But clearly we need much more information on climatic variation, phenological variation. You can see that a shifak on the west coast, can experience very different environments in different types of forest. And I think we also need many more studies looking at physiological adaptations of lemurs, such as the ones presented by Christine. Now, to return to my big question from the beginning, I'd like to summarize some of the main points for you, and it's as you can imagine, it's a mixed message. So we have certain aspects of the social systems that exhibit convergence with other primates, and for example, the solitary social organization, to the extent that it's been studied in other strepsirrhines, seems to be very similar. Also, the solitary species are all nocturnal, so that's a constraint that has persisted. And also female phylopatry seems to be ancestral in all these species. Looking at the mating system, lemurs show the expected patterns in terms of sperm competition and the associated adaptations. Also, the reproductive skew, male reproductive skew is very pronounced. Also, male parental care is rare and limited to situations where we would expect it to occur. And also, infanticide as a reproductive strategy is found in many lemur species. If we look at the social structure, I think the social complexity of lemurs is relatively rudimentary because of this lack of coalitions, the rarity of reconciliation, etc. So I think there we still see many differences at this level. But overall, in Madagascar, we have witnessed the evolution of all basic types of social systems, i.e. solitary, pair living, and group living species. But of course, there are also these other factors where lemurs seem to deviate. So for example, these dispersed pairs have not been described in any other primate so far. The small group size, adult sex ratios we talked about. Also this flexibility in group composition is found in some New World primates, but rare in others. Cathemerality is also something I didn't talk about, which we find among the lemurs, as we do not see any sexual dimorphism. These female evictions are also found only in a few other New World primates. And the lack of coalitions in the realm of social behavior, male tolerance, female dominance, are traits where lemurs are clearly unique. And also in terms of the big picture, as we saw in these phylogenetic analyses, lemurs seem to be much more flexible in terms of the evolutionary transitions among social systems that are possible. And so I think we can conclude here that based on this mixed evidence in terms of convergence and divergence in lemur social systems, lemurs are interesting for students of primate socioecology in general because they contribute much more diversity for some types of social systems. They also contribute some unique patterns. They also contribute, let's say, the low end of social complexity to comparative studies, and we already heard about their value in comparative studies of cognition in great talks in the first session this morning. Lemurs, I think, are also important and interesting for people in behavioral ecology more general, given these discussions and the importance of these questions about the evolution of sociality and monogamy and the determinants of social systems more generally. And finally, I think lemurs also provide a great opportunity for more integrative organismal biology of the type that I have been taught here as a graduate student way back in the last century at Duke. And with that, I want to thank especially my equipe in Kirindy, which has made all this fieldwork possible over the last 20-odd years, and also, of course, Peter, who was my PhD advisor here, Jörg Ganshorn, Charlie Nunn, Steve Goodman, were other important collaborators, and I thank you for your attention.